I have always been a peaceful person. That is what drew me to this neighborhood 8 years ago. The quiet cul-de-sac at the edge of Pine Ridge Estates where the HOA rules technically applied, but were rarely enforced. My property sat right at the boundary line, partially buffered by a small wooded area and a natural drainage ditch that separated my land from the more manicured lawns of the central neighborhood. The ditch never bothered me. In fact, during my second year here, my father came to visit for a month. He was retired then, restless with idle hands and eager to start a project. "That ditch cuts your property in half," he said one morning over coffee. "What you need is a bridge, something functional but beautiful." We spent 3 weekends designing and building it together. Nothing fancy, just a simple wooden footbridge with hand-carved railings that connected the two halves of my backyard. My father insisted on using cedar, saying it would weather beautifully and last for decades. He showed me how to notch the joints, how to create the gentle arch that would make the bridge both stronger and more elegant. "This will outlast both of us," he told me as we drove in the final nails. He did not know then that cancer was already growing inside him. 3 months later, he was gone. The bridge became more than a structure. It became a memorial, the last physical thing we created together. For 6 peaceful years, I crossed that bridge daily. It led to my vegetable garden, to the reading bench under the oak tree, to the bird feeders my father had also helped me hang. The bridge was entirely on my property, visible only if you specifically looked for it through the natural buffer of trees and shrubs I maintained along the property line. Everything changed when Karen Westfield moved into the vacant house across the street. She was from California. She made sure everyone knew where property values actually matter and neighborhoods have standards. Within a month, she had joined the HOA board. Within 2, she was heading the Neighborhood Compliance Committee, a position she seemingly created herself. I first noticed her standing at the edge of my property one afternoon, clipboard in hand, taking photos of my yard. I approached her with a neighborly smile. "Hello there, can I help you with something?" I asked. She startled slightly, then composed herself with a tight smile. "Just doing my rounds. You are aware that this neighborhood has covenants, correct? Your landscaping is quite—" She paused, looking for the word, "rustic." "Thank you," I replied, taking it as a compliment. "That was not a compliment," she said flatly. "And what is that wooden structure back there? Was that approved by the architectural committee?" "The bridge. It is on my property, well within my boundary lines. It does not require HOA approval." She made a note on her clipboard. "We will see about that. Everything visible from the street affects property values and requires proper authorization. You should have received the updated bylaws when I distributed them last month." 3 days later, I found a letter in my mailbox. Printed on official HOA letterhead, it cited me for an unauthorized structure and demanded I submit retroactive permissions or remove the bridge within 30 days. It was signed by Karen Westfield, compliance officer. I attended the next HOA meeting, folder of property documents in hand. The small community center room was half empty. Most of my neighbors avoided these meetings like the plague. Karen sat at the front table, perfectly coiffed hair and a red blazer that screamed authority. When it came time for open comments, I approached the microphone. "My name is Michael Chandler. I am here about a compliance notice I received regarding a footbridge on my property. I have brought my deed and property survey showing that the structure is fully within my boundaries and outside HOA jurisdiction, according to Section 3.1 of your own bylaws." The HOA president, a tired-looking man named Doug, began to speak, but Karen cut him off. "Mr. Chandler, even if your structure is technically within your property line, it violates our aesthetic guidelines. Section 12.4 clearly states that all visible structures must maintain the community standard. But it is not visible from any common areas. You would have had to come onto my property to even see it." Karen's smile tightened. The guidelines apply to anything that could potentially affect neighborhood appeal and property values. After 10 minutes of circular discussion, they voted 3-2 against me. As people filed out, Karen approached me in the parking lot. "You should really just comply," she said, voice low but threatening. Things get ugly when people fight the HOA. Rules are rules for a reason. I looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw something I recognized. A bully who had found a little power and intended to wield it like a weapon. What she did not realize was that she had just declared war on the wrong person. The notices began arriving with alarming regularity. First weekly, then twice weekly, then seemingly daily. Each printed on increasingly expensive stationery, each with more threatening language than the last. $50 fine, $100 fine, $250 fine, potential lien warnings. Karen had made my bridge her personal crusade. I reached out to the county zoning office, requesting clarification on where HOA jurisdiction ended and my private property rights began. The response came back clear and definitive. The bridge was fully on my land, outside common areas, and thus outside HOA enforcement capability. I forwarded the county's response to the HOA board email, copying each member individually. The next day, Karen herself replied, "County opinions do not override HOA contractual agreements. Your continued defiance will result in escalating penalties." That evening, I was watering my garden when Karen's SUV slowed in front of my house. She rolled down her window. "You know, compliance is so much easier than resistance," she called out. "That thing is an eyesore. It lowers community values." "It is a well-built bridge," I responded calmly. "My father was a craftsman." "Well, your father should have checked the bylaws first," she said with a dismissive laugh, then drove off. Her words burned in my chest all night. My father had been gone for 6 years, but the casual disrespect felt like losing him all over again. I resolved to stand my ground more firmly. This was no longer about rules or compliance. This was about honor and memory. I woke the next morning to a sound I could not immediately identify, a dog barking frantically, then a neighbor shouting. I pulled on my robe and stepped onto my front porch. My neighbor Jim was standing at the edge of my property, pointing toward the back. "Mike, someone destroyed your bridge," he called out. I ran barefoot across the dewy grass, my heart pounding in my ears. When I reached the drainage ditch, I stopped cold. Where my beautiful cedar footbridge had stood for years, there was nothing but destruction. Splintered beams, broken railings. The pieces had been thrown into the ditch itself, where they were now damming the water into a muddy pool. I stood there, unable to process what I was seeing. 6 years of memories, the last project I completed with my father, destroyed in what must have been a calculated act of malice. As the reality sank in, I felt something break open inside me, grief mixed with a white-hot anger I had never experienced before. "I saw a truck last night," Jim said, catching up to me. "Around 2 a.m., had some kind of company logo on it, could not make it out in the dark." I nodded numbly, unable to speak. Across the street, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Karen was watching from her front window, coffee mug in hand, that same smug look on her face I would come to know so well. I called the sheriff's department immediately. Deputy Reynolds arrived about an hour later, walking the perimeter of the damage and taking notes. He was sympathetic but ultimately unhelpful. "This is technically a civil matter, Mr. Chandler," he explained. "Since it involves an HOA dispute, we cannot intervene without clear evidence of who did the actual damage. The HOA has been threatening me over this bridge for weeks," I told him, showing him the stack of notices. "Their compliance officer has been specifically targeting me." The deputy sighed. "Look, I understand you are upset, but without video or an eyewitness who saw the actual destruction, this is something you will need to take up through civil court." As the deputy left, Karen emerged from her house and walked to the edge of her pristine lawn. She pretended to check her mailbox, all while watching my interaction with law enforcement. When the patrol car pulled away, she made her way across the street, stopping just short of my driveway. "Such a shame about your little bridge situation," she said, not even attempting to hide her satisfaction. "But now you can start fresh with a properly approved structure. I have some architectural guidelines I would be happy to share." I looked at her standing there, so confident in her petty victory, and something hardened inside me. I did not respond, did not trust myself to speak. She mistook my silence for defeat and smiled wider. The Compliance Committee meets the first Tuesday of every month. You should attend if you plan to rebuild properly this time. She turned and walked away, her heels clicking on the pavement like tiny hammers driving nails into what would become her own coffin of consequences. Because in that moment, as I watched her retreat, I made a decision. Karen thought she had won by destroying my bridge. What she had actually done was awaken something in me she was not prepared to face. The morning after the bridge destruction, I took a personal day from work. I gathered every notice, every letter, every email from Karen and the HOA. I photographed the demolished bridge from every angle, documenting the damage methodically. Then I drove to the county municipal building, a place I would become intimately familiar with in the coming weeks. The clerk at the property records office was a woman named Alina, probably in her 60s, with reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain around her neck. I explained my situation, spreading out the photos and documentation on her desk. "Pine Ridge Estates," she said, nodding slowly. "You are not the first one in here complaining about that HOA." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Between us, that new compliance person has been causing headaches for a lot of folks." Alina helped me file an official complaint about property destruction and directed me to the Public Records Department where I could request copies of the HOA's filed documents, financial statements, bylaw amendments, meeting minutes. Everything an HOA is legally required to submit to maintain its standing. "Paper trails do not lie," Alina said as I thanked her. "If there is something to find, it will be in those records." That evening, I created an anonymous email account and posted on the community forum. "Have you had issues with the Pine Ridge Estates HOA Compliance Committee? Looking to connect with others who have experienced harassment or questionable fines." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 24 hours, I had 15 emails from neighbors detailing their encounters with Karen. Robert, 3 doors down, had been fined repeatedly for a basketball hoop that had been in his driveway for 10 years. Elderly Mrs. Abernathy received violation notices about her excessive bird feeders. The Johnsons were threatened with legal action over their son's treehouse, which had been built before Karen even moved to the neighborhood. A pattern emerged. Karen targeted specific homeowners, usually those who had questioned her authority or who lived in properties she deemed problematic to her vision of an ideal neighborhood. She ignored identical violations from her friends or those who supported her on the board. I began organizing the evidence, creating files for each affected neighbor. I recorded phone calls with their permission. I saved text messages, emails, and photos. The paper trail was growing into a mountain of documented abuse. Then came my biggest discovery. While reviewing the HOA financial documents I had requested, I noticed something odd. Over $15,000 allocated last quarter for drainage improvement and landscaping on Oak Street. I knew Oak Street well. It was Karen Street, and while there had been some minor work done, nothing approaching that price tag was visible. I dug deeper. More questionable expenses appeared. $3,000 for community event planning for events that never occurred. $7,500 for legal consultation with no specified legal matters on record. Most tellingly, $12,000 for boundary maintenance and enforcement, a vague category that had never appeared in previous years' budgets. I took my findings to a local business center and made copies of everything. I was developing a theory, but I needed one more piece of information. I returned to Alina at the county office the next day. "I need to know who the actual board members are and if they have any relationship to each other," I explained. Alina pulled up the records. "The president is Douglas Whitman, vice president Karen Westfield, treasurer James Whitman." "Whitman, is he related to Doug?" Alina nodded. "According to our records, James Whitman is Douglas's cousin. They both listed the same family trust on some paperwork last year." The puzzle pieces clicked into place. Karen had allied herself with a family who already controlled the HOA. Together, they were redirecting funds to projects that mysteriously benefited their own properties and friends, while using compliance as a weapon against anyone who might question their authority. That afternoon, I reached out to Benjamin Morris, an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. His office was small but professional, his handshake firm as he greeted me. "So you believe you have evidence of targeted harassment and financial impropriety?" he asked after I explained my situation. I placed my organized binder on his desk. "I do not believe it. I can prove it." Benjamin spent almost an hour reviewing my documentation, his expression growing increasingly interested. When he closed the binder, he leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Chandler, most people who come to me about HOA disputes have emotions but little evidence. You have brought me something quite different." His voice took on an edge I had not heard before. "What this shows is not just a petty abuse of power, it shows systematic fraud and harassment." "Can we stop them?" I asked. Benjamin smiled for the first time. "Stop them? With what you have collected, we have enough here to burn their little kingdom to the ground. The question is, how far are you willing to go?" I thought of my father's bridge, now splintered and broken in a drainage ditch. I thought of elderly Mrs. Abernathy in tears over bird feeder violations. I thought of Karen's smug smile as she watched me discover the destruction. "All the way," I said. "I want to go all the way." Benjamin Morris explained that HOAs, for all their power, have critical vulnerabilities, especially when it comes to their own rules. "Every HOA is required by law to follow its own bylaws," he explained. "And every member has the right to see those bylaws, attend meetings, and under certain conditions, call for special meetings and votes." The first step in our counteroffensive was entirely legal. I submitted a formal request for the complete membership directory of Pine Ridge Estates HOA. Under state law, they were required to provide this information to any member in good standing. When Karen attempted to claim my unpaid fines disqualified me, Benjamin sent a letter reminding them that disputed fines cannot affect member status until resolved through proper channels. 3 days later, a reluctant Doug Whitman handed over the complete contact list for all 142 homes in our community. The next phase could begin. I started small, reaching out to the neighbors who had already shared their stories with me. We met quietly in my backyard one Saturday afternoon, Robert with his basketball hoop violations, the Johnsons with their treehouse dispute, Mrs. Abernathy and her bird feeders, and 7 others with similar tales of Karen's selective enforcement. "What we are facing is not just one difficult board member," I explained, showing them copies of the financial records. "This is systematic abuse of power and potentially criminal misuse of HOA funds." Mrs. Abernathy adjusted her glasses as she examined the documents. "My husband was an accountant for 40 years before he passed. These numbers do not add up. There is no way they spent $15,000 on Oak Street drainage." Robert nodded grimly. "That is Karen Street. They repaved her entire driveway approach and called it community improvement." One by one, they shared more examples. Security cameras installed only on streets where board members lived. Landscaping contracts awarded to a company owned by Doug Whitman's brother-in-law. Special exemptions granted to friends of Karen, while others received violation notices for identical issues. We formed what we jokingly called the Bridge Coalition, in honor of where it all began. Our first action was simple but effective. We would attend the next HOA meeting en masse. The monthly HOA meetings typically drew 5 or 6 people at most. When 23 of us filed into the community center that Tuesday evening, the shock on Karen's face was palpable. Doug Whitman stumbled through the agenda, clearly unsettled by the unprecedented attendance. When they opened the floor for comments, I stood first. "I would like to address the board regarding some concerns about financial transparency," I began calmly. "Specifically, I am requesting detailed expense reports for the Oak Street drainage project, the community events budget, and the boundary enforcement allocations." Karen's face flushed red. "Those reports are available in the quarterly statement." "Actually," I countered, "the quarterly statement only lists broad categories and total amounts. According to Section 5.3 of our bylaws, any member can request itemized expense reports for specific projects." Doug began to stammer about confidentiality, but Robert stood up next. "I am also formally requesting those reports," he said firmly, "and I would like to add the security camera installation project to that request." One by one, our coalition members stood and joined the demand. Karen's expression shifted from annoyance to alarm as she realized what was happening. "This is clearly an organized disruption," she snapped. "If you have concerns, you should raise them through proper channels, not ambush a regular meeting." "We are using the proper channels," Mrs. Abernathy replied, her gentle voice carrying surprising authority. "Section 5.3 is very clear about our rights as members." The meeting devolved into chaos as Karen attempted to adjourn early, only to be reminded by Benjamin Morris, who had attended as my guest, that bylaws required all member comments to be heard before adjournment. In the parking lot afterward, Karen cornered me by my car. "You think you are clever organizing this little rebellion," she hissed. "But you have no idea who you are dealing with. I have built this community into something valuable, and I will not let troublemakers like you destroy it." "I am not the one destroying things, Karen," I replied calmly. "But I am the one who is going to hold you accountable for what you have already broken." Over the next 2 weeks, our coalition grew. We created a private online group to share information securely. We divided research tasks among ourselves. Mrs. Abernathy analyzed financial records. Robert documented bylaw violations by the board itself. The Johnsons photographed the disparate enforcement between favored and targeted homes. During this time, we discovered something truly damning. Karen had been approving modifications to her own property and her friends' homes without going through the architectural review committee she so strictly enforced on others. Her backyard pavilion, stone fire pit, and extended patio had never been submitted for approval, a direct violation of the same rules she weaponized against others. Our coalition organized a special town hall meeting, using a bylaw provision that allowed members to call a special session with signatures from 20% of homeowners. We easily gathered 40 signatures. The community center was packed the night of our town hall. Benjamin Morris stood with me at the front, presenting a PowerPoint of evidence. When he showed side-by-side photos of Karen's unapproved pavilion next to a violation notice sent to the Johnsons for their treehouse, murmurs rippled through the crowd. "This is not about one bridge, or one basketball hoop, or even one power-hungry board member," I told the assembled neighbors. "This is about whether we live in a community governed by fair rules applied equally, or whether we live under the thumb of people who see rules as weapons rather than protections." Karen stood up, face mottled with anger. "This is slander. You have no right to display my private property in public." "Actually," Benjamin interjected smoothly, "photographs taken from public spaces are completely legal. And since you yourself established that anything visible affects community value, you made your backyard structures a matter of community concern." For the first time since I had known her, Karen seemed truly rattled. She looked around the room, searching for allies but finding mostly curious or hostile faces. Her empire of fear was beginning to crumble, and we were just getting started. The special town hall meeting marked a turning point. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other were now exchanging phone numbers, forming committees, and educating themselves about HOA governance. Karen's carefully cultivated atmosphere of intimidation was dissolving as people realized they were not alone in their frustrations. When several homeowners formally filed complaints with the state's housing authority about potential financial mismanagement, an independent audit became unavoidable. The board tried to control the process by selecting the auditor themselves, but our coalition was prepared. Benjamin had already advised us to invoke the bylaw provision requiring member approval for any financial specialist hired by the HOA. The audit was scheduled for the following month. In the meantime, pressure continued to mount. The local community newspaper caught wind of our struggle and ran a small piece titled "Neighborhood Divided, HOA Practices Under Scrutiny." Though the article was balanced, simply having our concerns aired publicly added legitimacy to our cause. Doug Whitman was the first to crack. As HOA president, he would bear primary legal responsibility for any financial improprieties discovered. One Tuesday morning, a brief email went out to all members. Due to personal health concerns, I am resigning my position as president of Pine Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, effective immediately. The vice president would normally assume leadership, but that was Karen, and the board knew putting her in charge during an audit would only inflame tensions further. Instead, they appointed a temporary executive committee of 3 members to handle affairs until a special election could be organized. Karen was furious. At an emergency board meeting, her controlled facade finally crumbled completely. "This is a coordinated attack on everything we have built," she shouted, jabbing a finger toward me. "All because one man could not follow simple rules about an unauthorized structure." The remaining board members shifted uncomfortably. One of them, Patricia Davis, who had always voted with the majority but rarely spoke, finally found her voice. "Karen, perhaps we should consider that there might be some validity to these concerns," she said quietly. "The audit will clear everything up if there is nothing to hide." "Are you siding with them now?" Karen demanded incredulously. "I am not siding with anyone. I am simply saying that as board members, we have a fiduciary duty to the community. If mistakes have been made, we need to address them." In a procedural move that clearly blindsided Karen, the board voted 3-1 to temporarily suspend her voting privileges during the audit, citing a conflict of interest due to her direct oversight of many of the questioned expenditures. She stormed out of the meeting, slamming the door behind her. The audit proceeded faster than expected. Within 3 weeks, the preliminary findings were presented to the temporary executive committee. The report confirmed what our coalition had suspected. Over $47,000 in HOA funds had been directed to projects that primarily benefited board members' properties or were awarded to companies with direct connections to board members' families. Most damning of all, the report included invoices for drainage and erosion control on Oak Street that actually covered extensive landscaping and hardscaping for Karen's property, including a water feature and retaining wall that matched perfectly with her backyard redesign. With Benjamin's guidance, I filed a civil lawsuit against both the HOA and Karen personally. The suit cited destruction of private property, harassment, and breach of fiduciary duty. The damages sought were substantial but not excessive, $25,000 for property damage and emotional distress, plus a complete restructuring of the HOA governance model. News of the lawsuit spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. The once fearsome Karen now hurried from her car to her front door, avoiding eye contact with neighbors. The carefully curated image she had built of the sophisticated, authoritative community leader had shattered completely. One evening, as I was sorting through more documents for our case, there was a knock at my door. It was Patricia Davis from the board. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice subdued. "There is something you should know." Over coffee at my kitchen table, Patricia revealed that Karen had not acted alone in targeting me. "After you questioned her authority at that first meeting, she became obsessed with making an example of you. She convinced Doug that if they let you get away with the bridge, everyone would start ignoring the rules." "But why destroy it in the middle of the night? Why not follow proper procedures?" Patricia looked down at her hands. The demolition was not supposed to happen that way. Karen hired a contractor to remove the unauthorized structure, but told them it had already been approved for removal. When they realized they might have participated in property destruction, they refused to work for the HOA again. "Do you have documentation of this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the anger rising within me. Patricia nodded, sliding a folder across the table. "Copies of the work order and the check issued from the HOA account. I cannot testify officially. I have family considerations, but I wanted you to have these." As she left, she paused at the door. "For what it is worth, I am sorry about your bridge. It was never about rules or property values. It was about control." The next day, I added the new evidence to our lawsuit. Karen's empire was not just cracking, it was collapsing entirely. Spring arrived with a gentleness that belied the storm of the previous months. The drainage ditch ran clear again, the last broken fragments of my father's bridge long since washed away. But where destruction had reigned, I now saw opportunity. It was time to rebuild, not just a structure, but a symbol. I ordered cedar planks, the same kind my father and I had used years before. I retrieved his old tools from the garage, including the hand plane he had taught me to use. This bridge would honor the original design but stand even stronger. Word spread about my rebuilding project. On a sunny Saturday morning, as I laid out the lumber in my backyard, Robert appeared with his teenage sons. "Thought you might want some help," he said simply, rolling up his sleeves. Within an hour, the Johnsons arrived with sandwiches and lemonade. Mrs. Abernathy brought her folding chair and a plate of cookies, saying she could not lift boards but could provide moral support and quality control. By noon, a dozen neighbors were in my yard, measuring, cutting, sanding, and sharing stories. We were setting the main support beams when a familiar SUV slowed in front of my house. Karen sat behind the wheel, staring at the gathering with disbelief. She pulled into her driveway across the street, then marched directly toward my property line. "What do you think you are doing?" she demanded, her voice carrying across the yard. "There has been no approval for this structure." The work paused as everyone turned to watch. I set down my hammer and walked calmly to meet her. "Hello, Karen. As established by county property records and confirmed by the State Housing Authority, this bridge is fully within my property boundaries and requires no HOA approval. The bylaws clearly state." "The bylaws you selectively enforced," Robert called out from behind me. "Those bylaws." Karen's face flushed. "This is still an active compliance matter. Any construction during a dispute is a direct violation." "Actually," said Benjamin Morris, who had stopped by to deliver some paperwork and found himself in the middle of this confrontation, "the temporary executive committee has already ruled that structures not visible from common areas and within property boundaries are exempt from architectural review. It was decided at last week's meeting, which you were invited to attend." "This is unacceptable." Karen's voice rose as she took 2 steps onto my property. "I am still on the board and I did not approve any such exception." Mrs. Abernathy, phone in hand, called out sweetly, "Karen, dear, you might want to know that I am recording this interaction for my safety, just like you advised us to do at the neighborhood watch meeting last fall." Karen froze, suddenly aware of the many witnesses and at least 3 phones pointed in her direction. She took a deep breath, visibly struggling to regain her composure. "This neighborhood is going to fall apart without proper oversight," she said tightly. "When property values plummet, do not come crying to me." As she turned to leave, I could not resist one parting comment. "Karen, for the record, this bridge will be built with proper drainage consideration, appropriate materials, and solid craftsmanship. All things your secretly commissioned demolition crew failed to consider when they destroyed private property in the middle of the night." She stopped mid-step, her back stiffening. For a moment, I thought she might return and escalate the confrontation. Instead, she continued walking, her heels punching into the soft spring soil of my lawn, leaving small divots in her wake. The bridge took shape over the next 2 weekends. We added subtle improvements to my father's original design: better water runoff channels, slightly wider planking, a more graceful arch. Each addition felt like a conversation with him, a continuation of our last project together. Meanwhile, our civil case progressed rapidly. Karen's attorney attempted to negotiate a private settlement twice, offering increasingly substantial sums if I would drop the lawsuit and sign a non-disclosure agreement. With Benjamin's guidance, I declined both offers. "This was never about money," I explained. "This is about accountability and ensuring this cannot happen to anyone else." The case went before Judge Martinez, a no-nonsense jurist with a reputation for fairness. The hearing lasted just under 3 hours. Karen was required to testify about her actions, the unauthorized demolition order, and her use of HOA funds for personal property improvements. Under oath and facing direct evidence, her carefully constructed narrative crumbled. When confronted with the invoices showing HOA payments for work on her private property, she attempted to claim ignorance, suggesting Doug Whitman had handled all financial matters. The judge was unimpressed. "Ms. Westfield," Judge Martinez said, peering over her reading glasses, "the evidence clearly shows you personally authorized these expenditures. Your signature appears on every invoice." The judge's ruling came swiftly and decisively. The court found in my favor on all counts, awarding the full $25,000 in damages. More significantly, Judge Martinez ordered Karen to issue a formal written apology to be distributed to all HOA members and permanently barred her from holding any HOA leadership position. As Karen mumbled through the court-mandated apology in front of the judge, her face rigid with humiliation, I felt no joy in her downfall. Instead, I felt something more powerful, the weight of justice finally arriving. This was never about revenge. It was about restoring balance to a system that had become dangerously tilted. The court case concluded just as my new bridge neared completion. Judge Martinez's ruling had far-reaching consequences beyond my personal victory. The court mandated a complete audit of all HOA actions from the previous 3 years, followed by a community-wide vote on new leadership. I had not planned to involve myself in HOA governance. My goal had been justice for my father's bridge and protection from Karen's vendetta. But as neighbors stopped by to help with the final touches on the new bridge, many asked the same question: would I consider running for the board? "We need someone who understands power but would not abuse it," Mrs. Abernathy urged one evening, as we applied the final coat of sealant to the cedar railings. "Someone who has seen how badly things can go wrong." A week later, the special election was held. The community center was filled to capacity, an unprecedented turnout for an HOA meeting. The votes were tallied publicly to ensure transparency. When the results were announced, I had received more votes than any other candidate. Patricia Davis was elected treasurer, Mrs. Abernathy as secretary, and Robert as vice president. Our first official meeting as a new board was dedicated to rewriting the bylaws. We established clear limits on board authority, transparent financial reporting requirements, and a community oversight committee composed of rotating non-board members. Most importantly, we created a formal dispute resolution process that prevented any single board member from targeting homeowners. Karen, now permanently banned from holding office, put her house up for sale 2 weeks later. I heard through neighborhood gossip that she was moving to another planned community across town, presumably to start fresh where her reputation had not preceded her. The day her moving truck arrived, I made no special effort to watch. The bridge had taught me that building was more important than dwelling on destruction. The final piece of my personal journey came on a crisp autumn afternoon, almost exactly 1 year after the original bridge had been destroyed. My father would have